Hi and welcome to Squizz.com, the connected marketplace. Today we'll be looking at the changes made to the Squizz.com connector in the 1.18 release. Squizz.com connector is a free piece of software developed by us that allows a business to connect any of its business software, databases, spreadsheets and files, storing data into the Squizz.com and Totex platforms, allowing businesses to save and make more money by automating data management and data transfer between its systems and other supplier and customer systems. Now you understand what the connector can do, let's look at the changes made into the connector in the 1.18 release. This release adds a number of new features and improvements to the connector's generic adapter to allow business data to be sent to any business systems and cloud providers that have a web service, and those web services accept receiving data in the JSON and XML data formats. Additionally, the adapter can save JSON and XML data to files in the file systems and other business systems could also read from. This opens up the possibility of sales orders, purchase orders, customer account invoices, and other data being sent to a wide range of systems, making it easier for data to flow between supplier and customer systems. In this release, we added additional features so that when JSON and XML data is sent or received by the connector's generic adapter across public or private networks, the HTTP request can now specify the HTTP method as well as set the content in the body of the request. This allows support for business system web services that can read or write data in the SOAP and xCBL data formats, once again allowing the connector to support reading and writing data from more business systems, which is helpful for customers and suppliers to get their data in and out of e-commerce platforms and into accounting and ERP systems. In this release, in the connector, we added support for the MyHub Retail Manager adapter to natively retrieve invoicing data out of the MyHub Retail Manager system, making it easier to have invoice data flow into connected e-commerce systems. We also added an additional system to the MyHub AccountWrite Premier adapter to make it easier for sales orders to import based on assigning customer cards to sales orders based on the unique internal ID of an AccountWrite card. We modified the DataPal WMS or Warehouse Management System adapter to support generating out account-specific product pricing based on grouped pricing rules that DataPal's WMS system supports. This allows multi-account contract pricing to appear on connected Squizz.com and Totex e-commerce platforms, making it easier for unique or specific pricing rules to be applied to many customers with less data work required in the DataPal WMS system. And lastly, in the connector, we added additional email settings for adapters and the connector itself to be able to send out emails when the outgoing email server requires a username or password authorization before it allows emails to be sent out and received at the other end. If that's not enough, follow the Squizz.com YouTube channel to keep up to date with all the latest features we're releasing, and sign up to the Squizz.com platform and follow the Squizz.com connectors feed to receive announcements and discuss any connector related topics. To begin with, let's see the changes that we've made to the generic adapter to allow data to more easily flow in and out of web services and to be saved to the file system in the JSON or XML format. In my example connector instance I have here, I have a generic adapter set up for an organization called the Quickie Mart. Now just to give you a quick background, so the generic adapter, that is not configured to import or export data from any one specific system. Instead, the generic adapter can be used to connect to and read and write data from many different types of systems, depending on how the underlying data is stored and accessible within that system. So Quickie Mart in our example, if I click on the settings button, we can see that there are several different types of systems that the Quickie Mart is using in order to store and manage its data. So it may be using CSV or spreadsheet files to store some data. It may be using an ODBC compatible database such as a MySQL, a PostgreSQL or other compatible ODBC database. It may be storing data in JSON or XML files. It may have its data stored in an external system that we can retrieve data from across the internet. Or it could be using an SQLite database file in order to store other information locally to the computer that this connector is installed on. If we go back to the connector and we click on the sales orders, we can see that there are a number of sales orders that have been created against this Quickie Mart account. So they've made a number of sales, and if we click on one, we can see here's an example where we had the Springfield Police Organization as a customer, as they have decided to order some products that want to go to their address, and there's a number of lines where they're purchasing donuts that are available there. So using the generic adapter, we can now get that sales order data as well as the purchase order and customer account data into the JSON or XML files. So if I click on the settings, so the first thing we have to do is choose the kind of data that we want to import. So for example, if we're importing a sales orders, we need then to choose the data source type that we want to send them to. So I've created an existing one here called XML files. And if that is assigned to a JSON XML Web Service file, we can then specify the location on the computer where that sales order file is going to be generated. So because I've got the protocol here set to file with the 3 slashes, that tells this generic adapter that when we import a sales order, we want to create a file for that sales order, and we're going to save it into this location on my computer here. So it's on the C drive in a folder called connected data, and I've got a folder there called Quickie Mart. So when that occurs, and then we've got this data type here that specifies if we want to save it in the XML file format or the JSON format. So if we go back to the data import, we need to specify the name of the sales order file and what it will be called when it's saved to the computer. So we just type in the word sales order. Now there is a hook that we can put into the URL that will put in the next ID or the unique ID of the sales order being imported. So if we put in these curly brackets and then we put a hash in between it, and then I'll put the unique number of the next order, such as number 3 or number 4 or number 5 when the next orders come in, it will place it there. So that makes sure that the connector doesn't overwrite existing files when it saves this sales order data to the file system. Lastly, we need to put in the extension. So we're saving XML data, so we'd put the XML file type. There's a few things that we need to set up here. We need to set up how the content of the file is going to be saved when it's saved to the file system. Now this content actually has to be in the JSON file format. Even though we're saving data in the XML format, the adapter will convert JSON data into an XML file. Now with the presets that we've got loaded into this adapter, we can have all this data already pre-configured and show an example of how that can be set up. So if we choose to be able to configure it to save XML data in the e-commerce standards documents format, we just click on that and then we click on the load button. And if you're unsure how adapter presets work, watch the previous 1.17 connector release video, then I'll be able to give you the details on how that works. So click on yes. What we're doing is we're allowing this data import to be overridden by this preset, since it will update both all the data imports that are available for this generic adapter. So we choose yes. Now it's asking where is the path that we want to store our XML data. So on my file system, I've got a folder called connected data. I've got a folder called Quickie Mart. So we may want to save this data just in there. So I'll copy the folder path to that directory, and then we can paste that straight into this data hook setting that we've got available here. So that's where it's going to save those connector credentials to, and we'll just put a slash at the end of that. Then we'll click the Save Settings button. That will create XML import files. That will pre-configure this to the directory that we specified, and then if we go to the sales orders data import, we can now see that it has been pre-configured with all the JSON data which we need to be able to build out an XML file. So we can see all the different fields that are available for a sales order coming out of the connector can be embedded within the content here. And this is the content that's going to get saved to the file. So there's a one data hook called billing address 1. So we know the names of the data hooks because they're listed here in the data fields tab. And then we can just simply put that into here, and then we assign that then to an attribute, whatever you want it to call, how your XML data is set up. So then you can pick and choose which data hooks you may be relevant for the system that you're importing this data into. So if we're importing it to a certain system, they may not have the concept of needing data which is the country code in a 2-digit country code or 3-digit. So we could remove those fields from this data. If they call their fields not billing address 1, instead they just call it an address 1, then we could change the names of those fields there as well. So we can completely customize the content that is going to be saved to the XML file, or is going to be saved to the JSON file, or is going to be sent to the web service, just by removing and adding hooks based on where we need them positioned within the data that's being generated. Now, besides those hooks, there are a few additional hooks that we got available for the imports. Every sales order needs a number of lines. So there's a hook called lines. So it's curly bracket, the word lines within. Each sales order also has surcharges. Each sales order also has payments. So these hooks, what they will do is they will collate each of the records that is generated by each of these child data imports. So only the sales order import needs to specify the URL or the name of the file of where the data is going to be saved. All these data exports do not to be set, and they just control how an individual sales line record will be generated. And then those lines will be all collated together for the sales orders data import into its data hook, where it will then embed all the lines that have been fully evaluated out. So the order in which the data gets actually generated for XML files, it will first get the line taxes and then embed them into the lines data. It will also get the attributes and embed them into the attribute profiles. The attribute profiles then gets embedded into the lines. The lines themselves get added with the text lines, and then they all get added to the sales order. The payment records will also get added to the sales line payments hooks. The product deliveries will get added to the lines. The surcharge taxes will get added to the surcharges data imports, and then that surcharge data will also go to sales order. So all these data imports will all have the data flow eventually to the sales order, which will build up the final JSON or XML file with all the nested data within that. Now on top of that, each of these hooks, we can modify the data that comes out of these hooks in the data fields. So for instance, in the billing address field 1, I may want to not just have an individual billing address. I may want the second and third billing addresses all to be in address 1. So I could use the concat function. So we've got our JSON functions that we can use within the connector. And then I might put the names of address 1. I might put a space between that. And then I'll put in address 2, billing address 2. And then I'll put a space there and put billing address 3. And then we've got all that data coming out of one hook. And so that's then going to appear within here, so then we don't need those other two hooks. Now, I could have done it that way, or I could set the data hooks here and do it this way as well. That is also possible. Now, generally, you want to use the data fields to do this because you've got access to the different functions where we can manipulate data that is available to us in the sales order. So the functions I'm talking about, if we go to the Squizz.com connectors documentation, and we go to click on the generic adapter, and if we then click on the JSON XML data field functions, this gives us a list of the functions that we can use in order to manipulate data. So I was showing you the concat function, we've got the replace function, the calc function to do calculations, the if function to check for conditions, as well as date strings conversions, and we can navigate up and down the JSON tree to get the different data out. So we can use all those within here. If we want to do more complex things like calculations that the data importing to requires. So for now, I'll just leave it nice and simple and easy. Now, if we were sending this to a web service, we'd need to specify the HTTP request method. Typically, you're going to use POST because that's what most web services require in order to get that data in, and that would be put in the content of the request. But in this case, we're saving it to a file, so this setting, it is not relevant in our example. So once we configured that up, we just click the Save button at the bottom of the window. Now, an important thing to note is because this JSON data is going to get converted into XML data, it requires two elements in the JSON. First, we need to specify this XML with a question mark before it. So that's going to give us the root XML tag that appears in the document. So that way, it will specify that this is a version 1 XML file that is going to be generated. And we've also got this root element, so that tells the XML file this is the starting element which all of our subsequent data is going to be embedded from. So we must have that data set there in order for the XML correctly be generated out. So with that now set, if we then try to import one of these orders, so I select the order, then I click on the import selected button. If all has gone to plan, you'll now see that the order line is now in green and is marked as yes to being imported. Then if we go back to the file system, under that Quickie Mart directory that I created, we can see that there is a file here called data import sales order, and it's put the number 46, which corresponds with the unique ID of that order within the connector. So then if we open that file, we can then see the XML data that the connector was able to generate for that sales order. Now we might want to just pretty this up just to make it look a little more readable. Notepad++ here has a good example of where that can be done. So then here's our sales order, and then we can see all the information about that sales order. So we can see the billing addresses that we set, we can see the delivery addresses, we can see order instructions, the payment method, and all the other information about it. So we can see the lines embedded within each of the sales orders. So there's 3 lines that are embedded here. We can see that the surcharges that were being put into the line, so we've got a freight surcharge, we've got some tax that was applied against that surcharge, and any other information that was available there. So we can see that the JSON data has successfully been converted into XML data, and that uses the JSON.NET .NET library to do that conversion. And then there's our final data that is saved as a file. So then a business system could come along and look at this directory and find all the orders that say start with data import sales order. Then they can read that data and import that sales order into their own system. So that's just one example of many examples on how we configure the connector to be able to generate out the data that we need. Within the connector messages log, there's a number of pieces of information that we can see that is happening in the connector. If we've got logs turned on and set to debugging or all, then we can see all the information that is going on here. So we can see that here's the log that showed us the original data, the JSON data that was generated out for this sales order. So we can see all that information. If we take another example, we might want to save that data as opposed to an XML file. We may want to save that data to a JSON file format. So if we then go and load the other preset that we have, so that we've got this preset called data imports to JSON file. So if we load this one, now this is going to overwrite our changes. So anything that we had configured previously in the sales order data import, this will all now change. So you only want to load these presets if you're setting up a new adapter or you're sure that you want to overwrite all these changes. That's what this preset file does. But it only does it for the data imports. It doesn't touch the data exports, this particular preset file. So we're going to do that. So we're going to load this JSON file. So we click the load button, confirm that we want to allow those overwrites to occur. Once again, it's telling us which path do we want to save these JSON files to. So I'll just use the same path to make it easy. And we'll put that file path in there, the save settings button. Now what that preset will do is it will add another, this time it'll configure it for JSON, importing JSON files. So it's got the same protocol. It's put in the path to on the file system to where these files are going to save, but this time it's set the data type to JSON as opposed to XML for last time. So then if we go back into the sales order data import, we can see that it's slightly changed. Now it's got the JSON file extension. We could put any extension, but that just makes it easy to understand the kind of data stored that will be stored in the file. We don't have any of the XML headers or root information that we needed to put in previously for the XML data. And then once again, we're just dealing with JSON data where we can then map and choose which pieces of information are relevant for where this file is getting saved. So with that now all configured and set up, if we go back to our sales order tab, let's re-import that same order again, but this time it's going to be saved to a JSON file. Do that, we click the select imported button. If all is successful, no errors will appear. Because that order was already in green, it will stay in green. Now if we go back to the file system, we can now see that the exact same order is now being saved as a JSON file as opposed to an XML file. And if I right click and view that file, we can now see here's the output that it has been put. It's the same data, it's just in a different format that then other systems can read this format. So JSON data is a little more concise because it doesn't have a lot of verbose information about it, which makes it easier to read and it makes it quicker for other systems to read as well. So once again, with the same billing information, we've got the same freight information and any other fields that we wanted to put in that order are all available here as well. So there's two examples where how you can get the connector to save sales orders as XML or JSON files to the file system. Now we can do that not just of sales orders, we can do it for purchase orders and customer account payments. And like I said before, this preset had already configured all the other data imports that are available to this generic adapter. So we don't have to do too much work in order to get this data output purchase order data. And in this case, it's going to save it in a different file name. And for the customer account payments, so that's payments to do with invoicing, that data can also be easily generated out just by loading a preset as quick as we saw before. Besides just saving the sales order, purchase order data to XML or JSON files, instead we may want to send these across the internet or across an internal network and have them be imported into other cloud-based systems or other systems that may be able to accept data using the HTTP protocol. So that's the same technology that we use to load web pages up, we can also use in order to send sales orders and purchase order data across from the connector into other systems. And those systems could be local, they could be on the same computer, or they could be on another computer in our own business network called an intranet, or they could be across the wider internet. Say we want to get this JSON data across the internet. So there's a few things we'd have to change. Firstly, the protocol of the data source type would have to change. So if we're sending it across the public internet, then you'd want to set the protocol to be HTTPS. That means it's a secure connection. Now, typically the web services, if you're sending a data, should support the HTTPS protocol, but if they don't, you may want to talk to them about making sure that that is possible. Otherwise, if it's internally to our computer, we might use the unsecure HTTP protocol in order to send this data out. So those are the possibilities that are available. Now, because we're sending it across the internet, we need to, instead of specifying the file path, we need to now put in the IP address of the computer that's either receiving the file. So that could be a local computer within our network. So we might be something like a 168.0.1 IP address of the computer that this computer is directly or indirectly connected to. And then we can put in the path of the web service or the business software that is able to accept the order. So if we had one example software may call it may have a root folder or path called web service, then it might be called a RESTful web service and might have a version number, and then it might have the type of data that we're importing. So data imports could be another one. So we specify all the paths, and this could be all the root paths up until the endpoints that we want to import this data into. Now, if this was going over the public internet, such as we had it going to, say, Squizz.com, maybe it has an API, so it has its API.squizz.com, then we could specify the public domain of that web service, and then we'd need to just get all the rest of the folders here correct in order for allowed to be able to send that data. When we're sending data over HTTP, there are certain headers we have to add for every request. So if you understand HTTP, the web services or the APIs will typically need to specify some extra information, such as a typical one is called content type. So if we're sending JSON data, that's normally set as application/JSON, but it could be something else depending on that web service. And then once again, we need to specify the type of data that we're going to be exporting out or importing into that system. And there may be other request headers that are applicable to that web service. So we're just going to take our example here. We would save this data. We'd no longer say we're importing files. We're importing it to a web service. Then we save those settings. Now in the data imports, if we go back to the sales orders data import, the only thing that we need to make sure we get right is this HTTP request method. So because we're posting data or we want to send that in the body of this request, we need to specify the post method, but each web service will tell you exactly which method you need to use. And then once again, we just need to configure the content itself to match whatever that web service expects. And the final part to this data import match result field is a new field that we've added. Once this data has been imported into or attempted to be imported by the computer receiving this data, it will then return back a response. And what we want to do is check to make sure the response is exactly correct, matching up with what we're expecting to get back. So if their response turns some content in its body called, say, result equals 1, this string we can match on any content within the result that's getting returned from that web service. So this result data could be not just at the beginning of the response, it could be at the end, it could be in the middle. And because we can set a regular expression, we can do some very advanced pattern matching to work out the content that we're looking for. In this case, we're looking for literal text here, so it's a very simple regular expression that we're going for. We just want the result in the data that's coming back, and it's going to have a value of 1 set. Now, if I had that comma not there, and the code was 11, then if I had result :1, it would match both the values 1 and 11. So you've got to be very particular on how you're matching the results coming back from the service that is importing this data. So once we set up our result matcher, we then also need to make sure that the data import URL is matching the endpoint of the web service where we're sending the data to. Now that endpoint might have other parameters, so it might have values such as it needs to specify options such as tax included could be a property, and where you'd need to specify key value pairs. You'd need to look at the web services API documentation to work out how to get the correct URL. So once we've set that up, we set the correct method, we've got our actual data set up, we've got our response, our expected response status, we save all those settings, go back to the sales orders tab, then we can import that same order again. So we select the order, and we can import multiple orders if we selected them all. Click the import selected button. Then if all is successful and no errors appear, then if we go to the connector's message log, if we had the debugging turned on, we can see a whole bunch of things that are happening. So if we had some sessions that need to be created for authentication, they could be created. But we can see all the different types of data, the order in which they're being written to. And then we're seeing the final generated JSON data, just like as we saw before if the file was being generated. So now we can see the content that's going to be sent to our web service. We can then see the attempt made by the connectors to upload it to the web service. And if we look within etslogs messages, we can see the exact URL that this data was attempted to be uploaded to. And then we can see the results of what is happening when that data is trying to be imported. And if there's no errors appear, then you know that the order has successfully been imported. So here's an example error message that may come up if an error occurs while trying to import the data. So in this case, the response data returned does not match what we were expecting. If we were expecting the result status equal to 1, the response data returned by that web service here does not have the contents within its data. So that's saying that there's an error that was happening. And you can see here that the web service is saying an error occurred when trying to import that sales order from their end. So then you may need to go into that system and to find out the reason explicitly why it didn't import, or this error result code would give you the reason why that did not happen. That's one example of where an error can occur. Other errors can occur if the response returned by the web services is not a OK response or not a created response. So these are the HTTP response codes, either 200, 201, or 202. Any other codes that return, the connector will treat them as being invalid responses or error response, and then that order will not be successfully marked as imported. So it's important that the web services use those response codes, which are pretty standardized in the web these days, for these orders to successfully import across the web or in the computer networks. So hopefully that gives you a good idea how you can configure a generic adapter to import data into both XML files using the presets or to JSON files, or import that data using a web service by simply changing a few configurations in the data source settings that we have here. And if you have any more questions about this, if you go to the connector documentation, there's plenty of information about how to configure these settings. If we go to the JSON XML Web Service data source type, we can see what all the properties of those settings need to be configured as well as we can see how all these data exports work. If we go into the data import section, and then we can see the list of the data imports and the kind of data that they're trying to import, and all the fields and properties that are available coming from the associated standards documents. And of course, you can always, if you're signed up to Squizz.com, you can also go to the Squizz.com connector feed, where you can post onto that feed any questions that you have about using the connector or configuring them to do this JSON or XML data import. The next improvement we added to the connector's generic adapter, if we open up a connector, is the ability to be able to set the content that we want to post to a web service in the body of the request. And the reason for this is that some web services require us to set data or give data in a certain form that allows the data to be then exported or retrieved from that system and exported out. So if we take an example where previously we set up this JSON data import web service, we may want to use that then in order to do exporting as well as importing. If we open up that data source type, we might change this name to reflect that it does both exporting data. And in this case, we're going to use this to export out XML data. So we'll change that name to be an XML Web Service. So if we then save that settings. Now, if we go to the Data Exports tab, for any of our data exports where we can read and export data, there is now the ability to be able to set 2 additional properties within the JSON XML settings tab. And this tab is also a new tab that has been relabeled to give us settings specific to this kind of data source that allows us to retrieve data from a computer across the internet or across any kind of network. The 2 new settings that we have now is if this data source assigned to it is a HTTP or HTTPS data source, then we can also set our request method. Now, by default, when you access the internet with a web browser, you're usually sending out GET requests to be able to get the content of a web page. Well, it's similar with a web service where we can request a URL to be able to get the data from a web service. But some web services may not want us to use the GET method. They may want us to use the POST method. And they may require us to put in more information about the data that we're trying to retrieve. So one example of this is a SOAP-based web service. And a SOAP-based web service allows XML data to be posted to the web service and then retrieved back and then parsed from the web service. So if I want to get some certain data out, say I want to get some product data out, Then in the HTTP request body, if this HTTP method is set to post or put, then I can put in some content within there. So if I've got an example XML data that I would want to post up with this request, in this case to get some products out, and this data is in the form of a SOAP message. Now it doesn't have to be in this form. There's many other forms that XML can be formatted as, but SOAP is one of the more wider message formats, especially in web services built in the middle of the 2000s, typically use this approach. So in here, I put in a SOAP message that that web service expects it to be in, and then I can set some additional parameters. So if I want to get products out, I've got the ability to set, in this example, web service to set firstly the field that the products are sorted by. So in this case, it may allow us to set the product name or a name of a certain product field, and then we can set the direction of that sorting taking place. So this is one example where we can use a SOAP-based message to be able to then give additional information of how we want the data to be returned back as. Now this will change depending on the SOAP-based web service that it supports. So it has to define all the different properties that are available and parameters that it expects. Whereas in other web services, you expect this kind of information to be put within the URL of that web service. So we just put our information in here. Now the other field that we've now got available for the JSON and XML web service data exports is to be able to set this data export result matcher. So just like with the data imports, when the data is returned from the web service, we need to make sure that that data has been successfully returned, and there may be a response code or a certain message or a certain piece of text that comes in response that tells us that is all successful. If that web service returns potentially a success code, maybe it has a success tag that maybe comes back, then we can search for that. And if that's returned in the content of the HTTP response, then we know that we can then interrogate it and obtain the data out of the product data that is returned. Now, if this field is left blank, then the connector will not try to check to see if the data successfully be returned. It will only check to see that the HTTP response returned by the web service is an OK response, or so that's a 200 OK response code, also 201 and I think 202 as well. If the web service does support providing more information about if the data could be successfully or not successfully sent or obtained, then this is where the place to put that in. So once we click the Save button, if we then close that settings window, then we then either run a product data export from the Adaptor export routine schedule. So we can choose our products data export that we want to retrieve from. We can choose the system we want to import it into or the data set. We can choose if we want to get the full data transfer or only changes. In this case, we want to get full. And then we can run a once off. And then what will happen is we'll see that in the logs that the request will be made by that adapter then to call the relevant web service. So here's an example of where that web service is getting made. And then if that is successful, then it will then return and export the data out. Now, if it's unsuccessful, so here's an example where we got a 404 error saying that the web service doesn't exist, then that error will be reported there and the data will not be able to get retrieved. But if it is successful, then it will be happy days. Then the data will then flow out through the connector and into the relevant system that is there. So this shows you an example how we can tailor HTTP requests to web services, adding additional data that they require, and that allows us, the connector, to integrate into more web services based on their very technical requirements that they have in order to import and export data and pass the required data around between those web services and business systems that support them. Now you can also test this out in our JSON XML query browser. So if we click on the data field setting, we have the test export query button. In the query browser here, there's been additional settings. So we have the HTTP request method is now set here. We can see the headers and all the information of how the URL is being generated by the adapter, as well as then there is another tab here called the HTTP request body, where we can set information and test out that request as well. So this provides a very useful tool to test out sending requests to the web service to check that we have configured it all correctly. And if it hasn't, then we can see the reasons why by running the query here and seeing the result status and any errors that are occurring along the way, as well as how the connector is being able to parse the data that is coming back to it. So this is very useful. It ties in when configuring these generic adapters to import and export XML or JSON-based data. And the last improvement to do with the JSON and XML data exporting functionality that I'll show you. If we open the JSON XML browser, I've got some example data in the raw tab that contains a JSON data that specifies a list of accounts, and for each account it has a billing address and a delivery address for those accounts. So if we look at that in a JSON viewer, we can see that we've got one account in this case, and that account then has a one billing address, and then it has an array of delivery addresses, so it's 2 delivery addresses. Now previously, for the generic adapter, we could only specify a path to get through to one set of objects or one particular object that we wanted to read data from. So in this case, it's going to read from all the account objects, and for each account record in the JSON, that we want to get not just the billing or not just one object or one sequence of objects, but we want to get multiple objects. Now the way we can do that is in the syntax. In the syntax of this JSON record set path setting, we can put in 2 dashes and put in the word union, and then put in 2 dashes after. And then after this what we're calling a delimiter, we can then specify another path that we want to process the same data that's coming from a web service or from a file, and then we can run this through and instead find different objects that we want to extract the same data out for, and not different objects and different records. So we're going to first get billing addresses, but then we want to get the delivery addresses, which are also in the same data. So we're going to type in the property of that, which is delivery addresses. And because it's an array, we need to put the square brackets to say that we want to get all objects within the array. So this union clause, when we click the run query, it will remove the union clause, and it'll first run this path and get out all the records for that path, and then it will then call this path and get out all the records for that path. And assuming that for both of those, when they pull out the records, they both have these same properties, then we can get out multiple records from the same data. So if we click the run query, then we can see in the results set now, we're now getting 3 address records out, not just the single billing address record that we got previously. So we are firstly going into the JSON data, we're going into the billing address, and we're getting its record, which is available there. Then another query is run to then go through and get all of the records that are in the delivery address. So we're now pulling out 2 delivery address records as well as 1 billing address records, and there's the data there. We've now got 3 address records from 1 customer account. Now previously, to do this unioning capability, where you're basically getting 1 record from 1 record set and then getting 2 records from another and then adding them together to get 3 records, you would have to use 2 different adapters within the connector. Now using this approach, we only need to use 1 adapter and we can set that up. Now you might notice here that because we got this parent node clause that's saying go step up through the JSON data for the billing address record and then find a parent record, which is this accounts record, and find its code field. And that's fine for the billing address because we only have to step up 2 steps in order to get that data. But that's a problem because if we look here, we're not getting the account ID that we need for the delivery addresses. We need to step up 3 steps from the billing address in order to be able to get access to the code of the accounts. So this is when we now need to start getting a little more creative within these field mappings in order to be able to do this stepping up process. If we use our JSON and XML functions that the connector provides, just that we got from our documentation, one of those functions is called the parent node name. So we're using this parent node name in order to find if we're looking at this record this path is finding, such as the delivery address records, then we can step up the hierarchy or set up the data tree within the JSON data and find the name of the attribute or object that these address records are stored in. So that's what this is doing. It's saying go up the tree 1 level and then find the name of the property that is then stored for that object. So now we're combining that, we're nesting that parent node name function within the if function, and the if function allows us to do a check to see does the value of this parent node name, so if it's address record, that will be set to delivery addresses. If that is equal to a string value that exactly matches the delivery addresses text, then we want to step up the chain and we want to do 3 steps in order to go up and get the code of our parent record. Otherwise, if we know that we're going to be in the billing address object, so then we only need to step up 2 steps in order to get then to the code field of that account. So then once we run that, clicked on the result set, you can now see that we are now getting out the 3 addresses for this one customer account. We're being able to get the customer account ID, even though that is at different steps away in the data for the different billing and delivery address information. We're being able to get all the information now we require in order to be able to export the addresses into the corresponding e-commerce system, into the corresponding Squizz or Totex platforms, and then allow that data to then be used by customers then to be able to easily and quickly select the address that they want to purchase their good, have their purchased goods delivered to. So this is showing you the advanced capabilities that the Squizz.com connector can do in order to be able to iterate multiple times through the data being returned from a web service or in a file that is storing XML or JSON data, and then apply different rules on how we can then generate a final list of records or multiple sets of records which are then combined together to have a final list that is outputted. So it's a very advanced functionality, but it also will simplify the amount of work that is required in the connector in order to generate adapters and then to talk to different web services. So have a play with this. You can do some very clever things with it, and just like how I've done here where I'm using multiple different functions to be able to find the data that we need to for a specific field that we're looking for. The next improvement added to the connector is if we click on the settings tab under the notification sub-tab, there's now new settings here to be able to configure a username and password that we require if we're using the connector to send out email notifications when certain things happen in the connector. And then if our SMTP is our own ISP, our internet service provider, we may have example.email.isp.com. And then that ISP or whichever service is being used to send out emails from the connector, they may require to set credentials. They may have provided us a username, a credential, so it might be our ISP username, and they may ask for a password that we can set there. And so then we can now save those settings. And then when we send a test email, the email, when it's being sent out, passes authentication. And if it does, then that email can then be sent to the inbox of anybody who needs to know about things that are happening in the connector. So that's what these 2 new settings are able to do. And those settings are also available on an adapter basis. If we click under the email settings section, there's now a thing called email server settings, and now we can set also username and password fields there available as well. So when an adapter, for example, if we want to send a notification when a sales order is being imported into the connector on both as successful or unsuccessful or when an attempt is made, we can choose that option. We can set our username and password settings here, and then an email will be received by the person who needs to be notified what the state of an order being imported to the connector is at. So that's just one example where you can do that. You can also do that for customer account payments when they get imported in. And there's other routines that will also be able to send out emails for a specific adapter. So that's what those settings are usually for. And when you set up a new adapter, by default, it will copy all the email settings that are available here. It will then add them to the new adapter that you're creating when you're setting it up within the connector and pre-populate all these email setting fields that are available there. Another improvement we added to the connector is to do with the MyOb Premier adapter. If I just add that adapter, and if we click on the settings button for the MyOb Premier adapter, and it also supports MyOb AccountWrite Premier and MyOb AccountWrite Enterprise, there's a new setting that has been added here called Customer Matching Field. And this field is used in order to determine which sales order field we should use in order to find the associated customer card within MyOb that will be assigned against the order when we import it in. So there's 2 options available. We can use, the previous option was always using the customer organization name in order to match it up. But now we've got the key customer account ID, and that's a unique identifier, the internal identifier of the card in MyOb. Now you can't see that card identifier by default because MyOb hides it from view. But it does exist, and we can see that when we export data out, the customer accounts data export, where this value gets set. In the old way that that adapter used to work, it used to look at this field called the customer organization name, and it used to match that up to the MyOb AccountWrite card name. If I go into MyOb AccountWrite Premier, and we click on the card file, and go into cards list, and just click on, say, an example one, so AZ Stationery Supplies. Previously, when the connector tried to import sales orders, it would use this customer org name field the value set within that to try to match that up with the value set within the name of the card. So in this example, A to Z Stationery Supplies. Now this could be an issue if the card name had been changed and then the order was then submitted, but it contained the old name of the card because there was a space of time between when the names of the cards were exported out to the associated e-commerce platform before they were then updated and the sales order were assigned. This could cause issues with trying to import orders into the accounting system. So instead now it's using the key customer account ID. Now we can't see the unique identifier of this card in MyOb, but there is a unique identifier that exists for each of the cards, and they're incremental, so they get numbered from the first account would be number 1 and the next card would be number 2 and number 3 and so on and so forth. So instead the connector will then, in this key customer account ID, which stores the unique identifier of that customer card in MyOb, then will be used in order to match up with the card. So then it doesn't matter if the name of the card changes, if the code or any other information of the card is altered, that will not affect the ability for the connector to import the orders. So it is on this recommendation that when we import orders using the MyOb account right adapter, we generally want this customer matching field set to key customer account ID unless the sales order being imported from a system where they do not know the unique internal identifiers of the customer cards. The next improvement we added to the MyOb Retail Manager adapter. So if we then install that adapter, if we then click on the settings of the MyOb Retail Manager adapter and go to data exports, there's 2 new data exports that have been added to the adapter and allow customers and sales reps to get access to invoices and invoices lines that are stored in the MyOb Retail Manager system. So already this has been pre-configured to make database queries to the underlying Retail Manager's database, and as we see here, and all the data has been mapped wherever possible based on the data that we can find. So it makes it simpler and easier setting up a Retail Manager adapter, since all the invoicing information can already be extracted out as soon as that adapter is deployed, rather than having to use the generic adapter in order to be able to configure to do the same thing here. So that has now been added to that MyOb Retail Manager adapter there. And the last improvement we've added is into the DataPal WMS, or Warehouse Management System adapter. So when a product account pricing data export is run, in the DataPal system, if we click on the action button and go into the special pricing menu item, within the special price window, we have the ability to assign any customers to a special price rule. But there's also the ability where any cards, customer cards coming from the MyOb account right system that are imported into the warehouse management system, if they have the word customer group and a star before as a prefix of the code, then instead of that being assigning a specific card to that special price rule, it will then assign all the accounts that have the A and B identifiers assigned to this rule. If we look back in account right and we look at the cards being set up in account right that are being synchronized to the DataPal warehouse management system, one of the things we can set are these identifiers. So we can say that this card is associated with the A identifier, the B identifier, the E, the F, and the G identifiers. We've got many options that we can assign these identifiers up to all the letters in the alphabet. So back in the warehouse management system, it will find all the accounts that have the A identifier assigned to it as well as the B identifier, and then all those accounts would then be assigned to this special pricing rule. And in this case, this rule might get a discount based on a 10% discount or a certain price, such as an $8.80 price for a product that is normally $13.20. So basically we can do contracts within the DataPal warehouse management system and assign those contracts to many accounts using the grouping method that the warehouse management system supports here. The improvement we added back into the connector software is for the DataPal warehouse management system adapter. When data is exported from that adapter, it will now be able to calculate out this group account specific pricing, which can then be shown on the web, so that way many customers can receive the same type of discount that was set up within the WMS system. Now, it's important to note that customer accounts coming from MyOb account right must have all the identifiers that are listed after this customer group prefix. If that card is missing a letter, then it will not be assigned to this pricing rule and it will be ignored. And as well as in MyOb account right, there needs to be a card set up that is also called customer group AB. Otherwise, that card will not be imported into the warehouse management system, and so then you would not be able to choose it from here. So that should help make it much easier and much more flexible in how to group pricing and reduce the amount of pricing data work. And the connector now supports getting that pricing data the way it matches up with the warehouse management system. And this gives a wrap-up of the Squizz.com 1.18 connector release. You can view more information by going to the Squizz.com documentation center at squizz.com/docs/connector. You can also go to the Squizz.com profile page. And once you've signed up and logged into Squizz.com, on the profile page, if you then go to feeds, then you can view the Squizz.com connector feeds. And then if you follow that feed, you can then receive notifications every time that a release has been made, as well as post any questions or comments you have about the connector software here. As well as you can also follow the YouTube channel for the Squizz.com to see the future videos that we post up into the channel there. Until next time, have fun with the connector and happy squizzing.